Welcome to MACC Part 2 in February. Glad to have everyone here. I am so glad that many of you are online to stay safe. We are not very safe people here. As we drove in the ice and snow, we should get hazard pay, I think. I'm just kidding. Thanks everyone for being here. I know we have a lot of commissioners coming off the NACO conference. I know myself personally, my daughter even had a state swim meet Thursday, Friday. I packed at 11 p.m. on Friday and then left for NACO. Got back Tuesday, and there was another council meeting for Broomfield, and so it's just been a little haywire this week. So thanks for being here this week, and we will do some introductions first, and then I wanted to make sure that everyone has their agenda up on their computer too, so that way we can follow the agenda. There are some links in that email as well. What we're going to do is just do introductions at first, and then Commissioner Watson and I will just have a brief discussion in the beginning, and then we'll get to minimum wage increase, and then our migrant crisis response, and then our housing legislation. And then we will adjourn by 11 o'clock. I do like to, really try to follow those rules and get out of here by 11 because everyone else has a lot of stuff to do. So thanks again for everyone being here. I'll probably go online first, and then we'll do the people that are in the room here. Why don't we start off with Tracy?
Good morning, Tracy Crafthorpe, Jefferson County Commissioner.
Can you hear you? I can't hear you, Tracy. I'm going to go ahead and go to Cody.
Cody O'Brien, staff for Arapahoe County.
Great, thank you. I have someone on my computer with the last name of Robles.
Yes, good morning. Nick Robles, staff of Boulder County, filling in for Mark Rosen today.
Great, thank you for joining us, Nick. Commissioner Layden.
Good morning, everybody. Abe Layden, Douglas County Commissioner.
Great, thanks for being here. And I think we had Danae on here, is that right? She actually is
Yeah, good morning, Chair Hinkle. I'm here. Danae Brilliard. I work at the City Manager's Office for the City and County of Broomfield.
Great, thank you for being here, Danae. Danae is sort of in two meetings right now. CML has their meetings at the same time MACC has their meetings. So us as a city and county are having some dual roles here. So Danae, thanks for wearing 2 to 3 to 4 hats today. Commissioner Baca.
Good morning, everyone. Lynn Baca with Adams County.
Thank you. Commissioner Luchman.
Buenos dias, soy Martita Luchamin. I'm a Boulder County Commissioner.
Buenos dias. And Heidi Grove.
Good morning, Commissioners. Heidi Grove, Boulder County Homeless Solutions for Boulder County Systems Manager.
Great, thank you for being here. Commissioner Kerr.
Morning, Andy Kerr, Jefferson County. Good to see everyone. And also, we could, at least I could hear Tracy. She did introduce herself, so I think the other folks online could too. So.
Okay. Great, thank you for advocating for your fellow commissioner out there. And Andy, we missed you at NACO, so.
Yeah, we did, Andy.
Yes.
You're lying.
I missed anyone else online. Charles Brennan.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm Charles Brennan with the Colorado Center on Law and Policy.
Great, thank you so much for being here. And then we'll go to the room out of Arapahoe County. We have a commissioner here in person.
Yeah, Bill Holan, County Commissioner, Arapahoe County.
Great, thank you.
Exhausted from NACO.
We're coming in on steam here.
Our plane broke on the way back and we had to spend the night in Chicago.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hopefully the exit row stayed in place and the doors stayed in place.
All our luggage got rerouted, so.
Oh man, that's rough. I'm gonna go back online. I'm sorry, I've noticed that Commissioner Lewis is online. Would you mind introducing yourself? Okay. Well, we noticed that you're here, Commissioner Lewis. We'll go back inside here, Linda. Linda Stevens, Executive Assistant for Dr. Cox.
Doug Rex, Executive Director, Dr. Cox.
Hi, Chantel Lewis here. I'm so
Great,
sorry.
thank you. No, you're fine. Glad to have you.
Lindsay Melky, Chief of Staff, Adams County County Manager's Office. Good morning, Ann Wallace. I'm staff person for Denver City Council.
Denver Commissioner Darrell Watson.
I know sometimes in certain situations I introduce myself as a county commissioner,
Yes.
and then sometimes I introduce myself as a city council member because it confuses people that I'm both, and that happens at NACO too. They're like, "Oh, you do both roles," and I'm like, "Yeah," and I get paid 1/10 of everyone else, but it's cool. Thank you everyone for being here today. If I missed anyone online, please let me know. It sounds like we got everyone. We did want to discuss just a little bit at the beginning. As our last meeting, we did talk about the resolution for expediting work authorization. Most people got back to us on that, so we really appreciate that. But Commissioner and Vice Chair Watson, I should say, and I kind of had a discussion as to what are our processes of going back to our fellow commissioners and getting the resolutions passed amongst ourselves. Broomfield is actually kind of in flux right now on how we do this process. So we would like to kind of hear back from various commissioners as to what your process was on passing it. And perhaps, Vice Chair Watson had offered to make some sort of codification for us, for MACC, so that way we have a definite process on resolutions like that. So if anyone online wants to speak to what your process was and how it went and how you'd like to see that move forward for MACC, we'd appreciate it.
And so folks aren't put on the spot. Let me jump in first, Commissioner Hinkle, and I'll share what Denver's process will look like going forward. And obviously, if there's any changes, we'll come to you. So I know Commissioner Lewis is on the call as well. Our process, because this board, we are not appointed to MACC, we will always go back to Denver City Council and all the other commissioners. We have a public process that it goes before one of our committees. So it will go before most likely budget, or it'll go before our finance FinGov committee. After it goes through that with public comment and for the commissioners to present the why we're doing this vote, it will then go on consent to our Monday City Council agenda. As long as no other commissioners call it out, then it will be simply approved by consent. And that's the process we're going to go through. It makes sense because it provides transparency to the community at large that, hey, this is what we're voting on. This is why we're voting on it. And it gives council members or county commissioners in Denver the opportunity to ask any direct questions they have. So our step often will take about 2 weeks. So if we have one of these going forward, we're going to ask for possibly a baking in of a 2-week timeline for Denver County.
At 350 degrees Fahrenheit, we're going to bake that in.
Bake it in.
Anyone else online that wants to have any input in that process? I know Steve is not online, but he was one of the ones from Adams County that said, hey, I need to slow this down a little bit and make sure that my fellow commissioners are on board with it. And so I don't know if anyone else online wants to speak to that process, or let me know. Oh,
Hey, Madam Chair, this is, oh, go ahead.
Commissioner Baca, did you have something you were speaking?
Good morning. I don't have an update from Steve, so I don't have anything to add this morning, but thank you for calling on me.
Oh, sure. It sounds like Commissioner Layden.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. And, for us, our process in Douglas County is pretty abbreviated. Anytime we have a posted public meeting, we know we have legal authority to make some decisions. So oftentimes, whether it's commissioner updates or any posted meeting for the three of us, where we have that discussion, as part of the agenda, we can move very quickly. So I'll just share that on the work authorization front, incredibly pleased to have had the opportunity to spend some time with both Adam and then staff and Commissioner Watson from Denver They were phenomenal guests and very well received in Douglas County. And I would just add that I shared at our homeless initiative, and I'll share here that from a work authorization standpoint, we discussed it and they had board support to support MACC in that endeavor. So just wanted to say we appreciated the bipartisan work there, and we were very quick in just being able to say yes.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Layden. That's wonderful. That means that we have unanimous, consent on that. So we're excited, and thank you for your feedback. And this time that we can communicate between counties like that is a huge win for us, especially between counties where we don't always align on certain policies. And so in this bipartisan way, we really appreciate that effort. Thank you, Commissioner Layden. Okay, next we have, is there anyone else? First of all, I'm sorry, I'm trying to navigate what's online and what's here. It sounds like no hands are raised.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Hall. We have a similar situation with us. When we get to a policy issue, we need to find at least a consensus amongst our county commissioners. And I think the 2-week delay is probably a good measure for us to check with our departments. A lot of these policies will have impacts, physical impacts on the various departments that will be affected by these decisions. So we just want to make sure that we understand it and that there is sufficient time for us to review and take a position.
Sure.
So generally, we're very supportive, as you know, with the policies that come out of Dr. Cobb, particularly in the transportation area where we're actively involved. In other areas as well, AAA and others that are going to be impacted significantly due to the financial issues that are going to emerge this next year.
Great, thank you so much. So Vice Chair Watson, too, do you feel like we could, codify that pretty easily? I think giving a 2-week time frame.
Correct, and I'll write that up, and then obviously we have tools we'll get it out to everyone if everyone has any questions, and then we'll just simply review it at our next meeting, but I think that's solid.
Perfect, great. Thank you everyone for participating. If you have any follow-ups, just feel free to email me and Vice Chair Watson. We work in tandem together quite nicely, so thank you all for your input today. Secondly, let's go to minimum wage increase. I know that we had Commissioner Stolzman here this past year introduce the idea of a minimum wage increase, and we had discussed it at the time. And there's talks within the region about working regionally about minimum wage increase and what those impacts are. We're still fleshing out, I thought that it would be good to know how this would affect those people who are unhoused. And I think that's sort of a real sort of specialty to really sort of know that impact. But for right now, we have Mr. Charles Brennan from the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, and he has come to us with some breadth of knowledge. And before I forget too, Commissioner Layden, you did submit something as well, talking about minimum wage increase. And so we included that in the agenda. We included the document from Commissioner Stolzman and also the document from Commissioner Layden. And we really kind of want to hear from the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, who's come very highly recommended by other commissioners to speak to this issue. So take it away, Ms. Brennan.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all, commissioners, for inviting me here to speak to you. I'm very pleased and I'm happy to be able to share a little bit about some of the research that I've done in academic studies and journals by economists that I've read through the different research that I've done at CCLP about the minimum wage. So I'm going to share just a brief presentation here to help guide the discussion, and then I'm happy to answer some questions and hope that there is time at the end for some Q&A. So with that, my name is Charles Brennan. I'm the Director of Income and Housing Policy at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. For those who aren't familiar with CCLP, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization with the vision that all Coloradans should have what they need to succeed. And we work in 4 focus areas: housing, health, food, and income. And so this minimum wage work, I think definitely falls within our bucket of income work. There we go. So Before I dive into sort of a discussion around what sort of the research or sort of academic literature around the minimum wage shows or suggests are the impacts of increasing the minimum wage, I wanted to take a little bit of time to first ground that conversation in sort of the ways that economists and other social scientists approach different studies, in particular approach studies of the minimum wage, because it's slightly different from sort of the gold standard that we would typically try to use in social science research. So typically, that gold standard is what's known as a random control trial. That's basically where you're taking two groups, you're testing out sort of a policy intervention on one of those groups, comparing the outcomes for both groups, and sort of seeing if the test group sort of had, you know, positive or different outcomes from the control group that we might be able to then attribute to whatever that policy intervention was. Now, that's much more challenging to do on the scale of something like an increase in the minimum wage, and so economists are typically forced to use a different approach. And in those approaches, they try as best as possible to mimic or replicate those conditions of a random control trial, but you know that's not always possible. And so one of the closest approaches to that RCT approach that economists use are known as matching pair studies. These are newer studies that really became possible when more states began to increase their own minimum wages above the federal minimum wage. And in particularly in the East Coast, that allowed for economists to compare, you know, in different labor markets or metropolitan areas that were sort of split between two different states, be able to compare economic impacts in a state where the wage increased versus a state where the wage didn't increase. You know, the theory being that because they're part of the same sort of labor market or metropolitan area, that they're sort of economically linked, and we can consider them to be, you know, similar enough to do that comparison. Before that, and sort of, you know, still currently, economists also use another approach that's known as a fixed effects model approach or fixed effects model studies. And these are statistical models or econometric models that they develop that are used to compare how an increase in minimum wage across a range of different places or different time periods in which a minimum wage increase took place, you know, how that change affected changes in other labor market variables. So things like employment, hours worked, wages, etc. And what those models try to do using statistics is isolate out the impacts from increasing the minimum wage from other underlying economic factors or influences that could be, you know, the reason why we see certain outcomes in certain places versus others. And, you know, it's this, they do this with, you know, varying degrees of success, and there's different approaches that the economists use to do this. And, you know, it can be a source of I think, there's a lack of consensus, I think, around what the best approach is to do this, or what way that we adequately can control for these different variables that could, you know, influence the outcomes that we see in analyzing the impacts of the minimum wage. And so I think, you know, important to know that both of these approaches have their limitations. You know, neither is perfect, and regardless of sort of the approach that's used, I think important to always remember that in any of these academic studies, that the findings are always meant to be interpreted as estimates with a range of likely outcomes, you know, sort of within you know, a different, you know, confidence interval, normally the 95% or 90% confidence intervals, so that we have, you know, at least some level of certainty, but, you know, not 100% certainty that this outcome is the likely outcome that we would see, you know, in any case that the minimum wage increases. So why does it matter to sort of, you know, understand or know the different ways that economists approach or study the minimum wage? I think it's important because, first of all, it demonstrates that economists don't even have consensus around how to study the minimum wage, let alone what impacts that minimum wage has, and in particular, what the impacts that it has on employment. You know, that's definitely, I think, you know, an area of the minimum wage research where there isn't still consensus or broad-based agreement among economists about what that impact is. I think it's also important to note when we're interpreting these studies or trying to apply them to public policy that we're making sure that the outcomes observed or understanding that the outcomes that were observed in one location or in one study do not necessarily mean that that's the outcome that we should expect here in Colorado or even in Denver or anywhere else that we're looking at increasing the minimum wage. You know, really, these findings are, you know, sort of particular to those places, those time periods, and so we should be, you know, applying their findings with some caution. As well, it's important to understand the different minimum wage policies that were examined in the studies because the design And the way that a minimum wage increase is implemented can have an influence on the outcome or the impact that it has, particularly on something like employment. And so studies, that more closely mimic or that are similar to the minimum wage policy that you all might be considering or that we might be considering, I think are important to sort of look to first as sort of guidance for how this particular policy might impact our labor market, and then sort of look to sort of those broader studies that might give us some indicators, but are different enough in terms of the policy that we're looking at that that they're not as applicable here. So sort of trying to compare apples to apples as much as possible. And the reason to do that is because there are different outcomes or different findings, at least in the academic literature, around that the policy design could have more of an impact on employment than other policy designs. So for instance, a minimum wage increase policy that has a larger bite on the labor market, in other words, a policy that impacts or would result in an increase in wages for more workers, is likely going to have a higher impact on employment than a policy that has a lower sort of bite or sort of applicability across the labor market. And then also, I think just is important to note, because it can be confusing, particularly when you're just looking at the findings, that many of these studies don't look at the impacts of increasing the minimum wage on the economy or labor market as a whole, but instead focus in on a particular sector or a particular population. So they might be looking at the impacts on full service restaurants or fast food restaurants, or they might be looking at the impacts on teen workers or low wage workers. And so I think it's important to know and understand, what populations, what economic sectors we're looking at, so that we're not, misapplying a finding or a conclusion that's specific to a particular industry across the economy as a whole. So now for I think the main slide that folks were probably looking for, which is what is the impact on employment? And as I alluded to, the studies and the literature is very mixed and not conclusive around whether or not the increasing the minimum wage leads to job losses. That said, I think there is more evidence in the research and more, consensus amongst economists that particular populations and particular sectors are more likely to see job losses than others. So things like fast food or low-wage service sector jobs in general. But I think we should be interpreting those findings that say that we see a loss in low-wage jobs with some caution, because by definition, that's essentially what we are doing, right? By increasing the minimum wage, we're saying, we don't want to have any more jobs that are paid at that wage level. We now have to pay them at this higher wage level. And so in the data, we would see those jobs as being lost. And oftentimes when studies look at sort of the wider impacts across the distribution of wages that folks earn at their jobs, we oftentimes see those lost jobs at the lower end of the spectrum being regained or growing, being added into the economy sort of higher up in the income spectrum. And I also want to just note that because it can be also confusing, and I've seen this misrepresented before, is that it's important to distinguish between studies that find that increasing the minimum wage leads to a loss of jobs versus studies that indicate that a minimum wage leads to slower employment growth. Those aren't the same, and I would argue that slower employment growth necessarily isn't a bad thing in and of itself. And so I think in that situation, it's another indicator that that this needs to be examined or analyzed with more caution, or that we should be interpreting sort of these findings and applying them cautiously to our public policy. So there's also been a growing body of research or literature amongst economists looking or trying to answer the question of why is there this lack of consensus amongst us about the impact that the minimum wage has on employment. The minimum wage is one of the most studied economic factors in the literature, and so it is sort of puzzling that there is still this sort of lack of consensus around its impacts on employment. And what economists have found, and through other studies or looking at other ways in which the minimum wage might lead to changes in the labor market, economists have pointed to that the labor market model, or sort of the framework that we use to understand how the labor market works and how employers react to increased labor costs, sort of that labor market that's used in the studies really matters. And so what's most common in economic research on the minimum wage is the assumption that the labor market being examined is perfectly competitive. And sort of in a perfectly competitive labor market, the only way that an employer can adjust to an increase in the minimum wage and thus higher labor costs is to reduce their labor force. So in other words, thinking about supply and demand, if the price of labor goes up, then the demand for labor will go down and lead to a lower supply of labor or lower quantity of labor. That's sort of in theory, makes sense, using supply and demand and sort of looking at a supply and demand curve or diagram, yes, that is sort of the effect that we would assume would happen if the minimum wage increases. But, I would argue, and I think, it's convincing in the literature that there are other ways that employers can use, or, sort of other ways that employers adjust to increases in the minimum wage in practice, that this isn't their only option. And so when we use more complex or different models of the labor market to examine the impacts of the minimum wage, there tend to be less findings or studies that see a negative impact on employment. And what they see instead is that employers use what are known in the literature as channels of adjustment, so different ways or behavior changes that employers use to sort of defray or absorb those costs, those increased labor costs that come from increasing the minimum wage. And there's a growing body of research looking at a range of different channels of adjustment that have been used that I think provides, in my view at least, convincing evidence that this is sort of a method or sort of a way that employers adjust to increases in the minimum wage other than laying off workers. And the channels of adjustment that will be used are going to differ by the employer, their size, their sector. Not all of these are available or are options for employers. And I'll also note that, just because we might say, yay, increasing the minimum wage doesn't lead to, negative employment outcomes, it doesn't mean that these other channels of adjustments that are used don't also potentially have a negative impact on low-wage workers or, in essence, the folks that we're trying to help by increasing the minimum wage. And so here, just as a list of some of the channels of adjustment or other ways in which, research and the, academic studies have documented employers adjusting to changes in labor costs due to increases in the minimum wage. Other than just reducing employment, they might reduce employee hours, which may not be a bad thing for workers if they're being paid more per hour. They could come out on top in that scenario. There's research that shows that employers often pass on those increased labor costs and increased prices, although the magnitude of the increase in prices really depend on the sector or the part of the economy that we're looking at. They might also seek to increase worker productivity through training new technologies or asking more from workers. And in other words, sort of asking workers to produce more, increasing their revenues to sort of account for the increase in labor costs. And there's also growing evidence that employers see benefits from reduced costs from lower worker turnover as a result of higher minimum wages. And there's possibly many others. This is not by no means an exhaustive list, but I think demonstrate that there are a number of ways other than reducing employment that employers do and can adjust to increases in the minimum wage. So in sum, and I hope I didn't go over my time and still have time for Q&A, but just to summarize, there isn't strong consensus still on the impacts of the minimum wage in the economic literature around sort of its impacts, particularly on employment. In that the findings often depend on the approach that economists use or their sort of assumptions about the way that the labor market works. These studies looking at significantly different minimum wage policies or labor markets than sort of what we're considering here in Colorado or in the region should be interpreted and applied to our public policy with some caution, though they are still helpful, I think, to look at. We know from the literature as well that employers use different means other than reducing employment to adjust to increases in the minimum wage. And I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the impacts of local minimum wages, but because that's a relatively new area of study in the academic literature, and so there aren't as many studies looking at the impacts that a local minimum wage might have, either on the regional economy or sort of the state economy. And so, but what studies that have been done suggest that there are similar effects as what we see in studies that looking at increases at state level minimum wages or national minimum wages. And just to sort of sum up, I think it's important to note that, this is still a growing body of research, ideas and methods to analyze the impacts of the minimum wage are constantly changing. And so We should, this is what we know now, but we should also continue to have an open mind in the future as new research and methods are used to examine these impacts. So thank you. And now I'm happy to answer any questions if folks have them.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I really appreciate all of what you presented today. We might have more questions now than we have answers. It seems like, I was a math teacher in high school, and we always talk about outliers, and statistics was not my favorite thing. So those things are not very fun to talk about, but I appreciate the lens at which, you're kind of bringing this on a broad scope. And we'll definitely open it up to questions that anyone has of Mr. Brennan. And then after questions, I think it'd be good to open it up for discussion as well. But if there are any questions for Mr. Brennan at first, we'll go online first. If you have any, please raise your online beautiful yellow hand. Commissioner Lochaman.
Hi, how about just a regular hand?
There you go.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm in between like 3 different types of digital platforms this morning. Thank you. Thanks, Charles, for the presentation. I just had a question. So in 2022, I was leading the consortium of cities in Boulder County in our region that includes Broomfield in these discussions. Again, they had started in 2019 and we were working on it in 21, just trying to figure out how to do this. And we moved that forward at the Boulder County level. In 2023, I was no longer leading that work, but then as a county, we decided to move forward, and we're still working in a support effort, but not the lead on that work for the rest of our region. The question I wanted to ask you, Charles, is about what we decided to do was to go ahead and move forward with our partners in Denver and Edgewater using the state legislation that allows us to respond to workers. And we also decided to put together an economic vitality type of fund so that we could support some of the business owners that are trying to figure out what their channels of adjustment may need to be, may evolve to be. And so I'm wondering if in the research that you have, if you have any similar research that would parallel to that as we're defining that process and we're looking at criteria to be able to support businesses who have those same concerns and are trying to figure out what their levers are.
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question, and I don't know that I have a great answer for that. But I think certainly being able to understand where the impacts of the minimum might be felt strongest in terms of the different types of businesses or economic sectors. I think that could be used as a way to perhaps target or prioritize aid to certain types of businesses that we know tend to have higher labor costs, or labor costs tend to be a higher share of their total costs, and so are more sensitive to increases in the minimum wage. Restaurants and fast quick service restaurants and those sorts of businesses, other retail, and low wage service sector jobs do tend to be in that situation. And so, to the extent that aid is perhaps targeted or reserved for employers or businesses in those sectors, that might be a positive policy choice to prioritize those groups. I also think that looking at the size of employers too is important. I think there is evidence that larger employers are more able to absorb these higher labor costs as compared to smaller employers, and so targeting assistance to those small employers, I think, could also be an effective way to sort of help support or give a little bit of assistance to employers as they figure out how they're going to adjust to increases in the minimum wage and in their higher labor costs. I'll also note too, though, that there is also research that demonstrates that labor costs are just one of many different costs that employers face every year or see increases in every year. And so this is just one of many things that employers are balancing. And so I think too, looking at ways to support employers in other areas or to reduce costs that might also be sort of competing with or creating more challenge when it's taken in tandem with an increase in those labor costs from the minimum wage. That could be a way to also provide some assistance or some breathing room for smaller businesses in particular as they work to adjust to sort of this higher labor cost that they're facing.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was one of the pieces we were trying to determine is what does small business mean? And everybody has a little different definition of it depending where you're at in the spectrum. I also just wanted to appreciate the comment that you made around the real cost savings of having less turnover as an organization, a company, or a business. And I hadn't thought about that one specifically, but I think that's a good one for folks to highlight as they're going out and having these conversations with their elected bodies and potential supporters in their community. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
And I'll also note just quick. Oh, sorry. I'll just note real quickly. I know I've said a lot about studies and research and haven't really produced sort of specific titles or documents or anything like that. I have all of them available and happy to share sort of a my range of resources that I've been able to collect and gather, and also very open to sort of receiving other studies that might be in addition to what I've shared. So just wanted to make sure that that was clear. That happy to be sharing and sort of share my learnings and data and research with others too.
Great, thank you so much. We will take any and all information that you have. Commissioner O'Dorisio.
Thank you. I kind of want to, first of all, I think it would be awesome if we did take you up on that offer to share some of that data and those studies. I think what was also, I appreciate that last question and that last dialogue about, it's not just about wage, but backfilling for some of the other burdens that we are placing on some of the same businesses. And we all worked our asses off to try to save a bunch of restaurants and folks in the restaurant and hospitality industry during COVID. And so conversations I've had with restaurants is, why would you go through all that effort to save us and then do this to us? And I think if we can identify that list of other stuff where we can backfill and have both and instead of either or, that list would be very helpful for us, because not every business has even the capacity to do some of those other adjustments, you call them? What were those things that?
Channels of adjustment. Yeah, I hate using that technical term, but because that's there, I just wanted to share it. So in case you see it elsewhere, you know what that's referring to.
It's great because it shows, look, like, all right, if employers like all worried about the wage, you say, well, here's other channels adjustments that other businesses have used historically, and can you find place there? And then the feedback we may get is no, and here's why. And then we have to determine, do we still want to push with the wage piece at this level, or can we give a little bit somewhere else in order to make wage important? Because the last thing we want is to kill the golden goose also for some of these employers in these small communities who do rely on these small businesses. But our goal is to also not let people be working at the wages that some people are. I think that's important too. So I really appreciate that, and I'd love to see some of those studies. Are there, you also highlighted the fact that not only are the studies not concrete or universal across the board, but maybe the methodology doesn't have to be either. So knowing that we're trying to be as regional as possible to be consistent, so one side of one street doesn't have a different standard than the other side of the street, how do we balance that accommodation of needing to localize specific local and neighborhood level factors while also trying to create some consistency at a regional level?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, for that question. I think that is the $1 million question. I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I think what I would say is that particularly in communities or counties like Adams County or Arapahoe County, where you sort of have a range of different community types, or sort of on the eastern side, very rural, smaller communities versus sort of metro area Denver on the other end. That the research does suggest that a policy that increases the minimum wage across the entirety of that kind of diverse community could have very different impacts on one end than the other. I think that's where where I was talking about the bite of the minimum wage is really important in terms of understanding, okay, how many workers are going to be impacted by this increase, and how does that then sort of create other challenges for employers, or because there could be cases like in I think this came up somewhat in Boulder County, where employers are already paying their lowest paid employees higher than the minimum wage that exists, and so increasing the minimum wage isn't really going to have as big of an impact because there is no increase in labor costs for employers in that situation. And so being able to I think be more, fine-grained and sort of also understanding, okay, how does that increase that we're contemplating does that make sense for all of these communities? There is, a growing body, particularly looking at local minimum wage increases, that suggests that increases that occur in higher wage or higher income communities will also have less of an impact, and also sort of have secondary effects of in some ways redistributing some of that income or making that community more equitable, because we've got higher wage work, higher income consumers that might be paying more in prices, but they can afford that because they're already higher wage. And in those situations, then those workers are benefiting because they might not live in that community, but they work there and are earning higher wages, and might not be impacted by an increase in prices because they don't shop or they don't go to the businesses that are in that community that have higher prices. And so I think it does sort of open up much more areas that we need to consider looking at local minimum wages versus sort of a statewide minimum wage. But I think it does allow us, though, to be more targeted and really specific in terms of where we might want to or be able to increase the minimum wage in certain higher costs or higher wage parts of the state here in Colorado that might not be desirable or might not be as beneficial in more rural parts of the state where there's lower cost of living.
Well, and if I might just follow up, I know Abe's next, but you just hit the nail on the head. Raising the minimum wage in Boulder may not impact the businesses as much in Boulder, and it may help the employees who can't afford to live in Boulder. But then the folks in Adams County may get some benefit from that, but they're also going to be increasing their costs if most of the working folks that are maybe working in lower wage jobs are also living in those areas, and now their local expenditures are going up. I think that's an important factor that you bring up that we have to also take into account in our analysis in Adams County.
Yeah, and I think too, also understand the impact, because there are different, the minimum wage doesn't lead to across the board price increases. So it's very specific and in particular sort of parts of an economy. So for instance, thinking about like the whole bucket of goods that get included in the consumer price index, when folks have studied sort of the impacts of local minimum wage increases, there has been documented increases in things like food away from home, documented price increases in things like food away from home, but not in other areas. And so I don't want the takeaway to be that it leads to inflation across the board. It's really impacting very particular price items that could see a price increase, not sort of across the board increases.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Commissioner O'Dorisio. We technically are at the end of this time, but we'll allot 5 more minutes. Commissioner Layden, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. And I really wanted to say thank you to my colleagues and to Mr. Brennan as well. I think the academic honesty with which you approach, the entire body of understanding is really helpful, though. When this got brought up, I made a commitment to everybody here to go back to Mike, do that research and ensure that, we were really looking at this from an academic standpoint. What I appreciate is Mr. Brennan conceding that, first of all, there is no consensus in terms of outcomes and how these policies can affect, economies on a macro level. Locally, there are some pretty clear examples, and, we did go back and do the research. And I just wanted to clarify, so part of what we did is look specifically at Denver. And so, when you look at the 2023 CDLE report, I'll speak just specifically to statistics. And we have these theories and these policies, but I think the statistics are very clear and speak for themselves. And last time what we said was, well, our intention is great. We all want to make sure that lower income workers are able to make more, but we have to bifurcate between intention and outcome. And anytime the government interferes with the economy, boy, we have to be pretty certain that there's some consensus around the research. And of course, there's, and I really do respect my home county of Boulder County and the efforts that they're engaged. But again, to Commissioner O'Dorisio's point, this is the Grim Reaper for restaurants. And I think there's some really significant stakeholding that would have to occur before we move forward on this. And we have all due respect to the local counties. But again, the restaurant industry has been very loud and clear that this would be difficult for them. So just going to the specific statistics from the 2023 CDLE report, a couple of things. First, Denver's comparably high employment rate has decreased since 2020, after instituting that minimum wage. Second, increase in the local minimum wage did not result in a comparable increase in income. And then, of course, finally, a minimum wage may negatively affect areas of sales tax revenue. That memo is in your packet. I would encourage everybody to just take a peek at that if you get an opportunity. But again, in 2019, Denver had less unemployment than the rest of the state, but that difference in the rate of unemployment decreased in 2020 after implementing a local minimum wage. So take a look at the memo. I know we're short on time, but it really, I think, undergirds this notion, which our colleague, Mr. Brennan, has not discounted, that when you have a mandatory minimum wage, those local mom and pops will hire fewer people, they will increase prices, and many of which are that are in the retail, hospitality, and restaurant industry may have to close down or shut down because they simply cannot afford to pay those wages. So again, trying to be just academically and intellectually honest about what we're seeing out there, both statistically and in theory.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Layden. Do you have an answer or a response to that, Mr. Brennan? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I thank you, Commissioner Layden. I appreciate that point, and I do want to just make a note on the CDLE report, because I know that's come up in many places in this conversation, this larger conversation around the minimum wage and local minimum wages here in Colorado. That I would just urge extreme caution in interpreting the findings from that report, just because there was no attempt, and I think they acknowledge this in the report, to adjust or control for the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of the public health orders and sort of economic impacts that resulted from those had on these statistics. So, I think, if we were to take a more academic approach, we would attempt to control for these using different statistical or econometric models, which is something that the CDLE didn't do because they didn't have the resources and capacity to do so. And so, I think that's a really important thing to remember as we're looking at the impacts of the minimum wage increases that have occurred here locally recently, is that it's really difficult to untangle those impacts from the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, because they happened at the same time. And that we're not I would not, say that we're certain from looking at that CDLE report to what extent those impacts that we saw in terms of, Denver's sales tax and other economic indicators that you mentioned, to what extent those were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of the different ways that Denver was addressing sort of the impacts of the pandemic versus other parts of the metro area.
Great, thank you, Mr. Brennan. And Commissioner Layden is now here in person. He went from online to in person.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Magic sometimes. I know.
We might need a cape here, I'm not sure.
Once in a while, I'll just say again, incredible respect to Mr. Brennan. Appreciate the intellectual honesty. And to Commissioner Odorizio's point, to the extent you can marshal some of those statistics and perhaps help us with the analysis. But again, I think what we're hearing from today is no clear academic or theoretical consensus that the minimum wage option here necessarily benefits or is the detriment to local communities. And so I think when there's a question, it gives me pause as an elected official.
And if I could clarify really quickly, I am saying that there is no impact on employment, but that doesn't mean, or that the impact on employment is uncertain. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other benefits that we might see from increasing the minimum wage that we must also sort of weigh against those impacts to employment that we might see in specific sectors or amongst specific populations. So, I think there's a tendency to hyper-focus on employment in these conversations, and that comes, I think, at the detriment of considering other benefits or ways that increasing the minimum wage might, lead to better outcomes for low-wage workers in our economy.
Great, thank you, Mr. Brennan. We are over on time and we appreciate your efforts. Sorry, Bill, we're gonna have to move on to our next subject. We would love to have any extra information that you have, if you could send it to us. And then we will send it off to all of our MACC members. But we really appreciate your time today. I know in Broomfield City and County, it is on our top list to discuss at our next focus session on March 1st and 2nd. And so we have 5 items that we were talking about, and 2 of those are on our agenda today, which is the assisting Denver in their migrant crisis. And then also our number 1 goal is to just assess and look at our minimum wage increase and working as a region. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, up next, item number 3, migrant crisis response. I would love to have Vice Chair Watson introduce a new member in the room as well to discuss this and take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner Hinkle. I'm really happy to see Joshua Posner here. He's the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Mayor's Office. He's doing a lot of great work, and I thought it would be instructive for Joshua to kind of share what Denver County is doing in our response to the asylum seekers and the migrant crisis.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Councilman, and thank you all, Matt, for having me here again. One of our team members made a joke that crises seem to follow me everywhere because I last spoke to you about how's 1,000. So, you know, I do not bring these crises in, but always excited to work with really amazing cohort in the city and county of Denver to work on addressing some of these issues. So right now, happy to speak with us a little bit about the way Denver is addressing newcomers as they're coming across our southern border, and we're getting folks from buses or just through their own travels into the city and county. You've undoubtedly heard about the financial crisis that this puts the city in. I can't really speak to all of the details in terms of what we're projecting out other than what the mayor's communicated publicly, but we'll be able to talk a little bit about our operations, our intake process, and some actually really innovative stuff we're doing today that I was just coming from, and sorry I was late. So since the migrant crisis began about a year ago, Denver has taken in about 40,000 newcomers. A lot of those come from the southern border, primarily via buses that are being sent by Governor Abbott, either from El Paso County or Brownsville. And that's really where we're seeing this major influx. We do have some folks that come through on their own, whether it's Greyhound through another city like San Diego, Kansas City, things like that, make their way to Denver by their own means. But the vast majority of folks that enter into the city as a newcomer, as an asylum seeker, come from those buses. We have seen various flows of them over the last few months. It's when you look at the data, you can see the waves pretty clearly that they ebb and flow. Right now, we're kind of in a lull period. We only have had 2 buses over the last week that we've accepted into our intake process. But earlier in January, we were sometimes accepting 11 buses a day. And so that range varies. Those buses typically have about 50 individuals on them. The most recent buses we've been seeing are about 36. We are able to somewhat anticipate how many buses are coming from Texas based on the information we're getting from FEMA and the border. And so the City of Denver's Office of Emergency Management has a direct line to FEMA where they start to understand what those numbers may start to look like in terms of folks crossing from the Mexico border into the United States. And we use that to a little bit project on what Governor Abbott may or may not do. There's not a collaboration there. There's not a discussion. We just get a notification that a bus is coming in about 8 hours, and we kind of react from there. Our team, Denver Human Services, acts as our intake center. And so if buses are dropped off during the day, we can set up intake operations at the web building. And then that's only between the hours of 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Then if buses come after hours, they're directed to one of our shelters where those guests will stay for an evening and then be processed through intake. That intake process basically collects information about their name, where they're coming from, and asks for their A number, their alien registration number. It is actually a really key part to kind of what our ongoing process will look like. That number allows us to look into how they came into the country, whether or not they are straight asylum seekers or if they were paroled and given themselves up at the border. If they have that distinction, that latter distinction, it allows us to do some really interesting things in terms of work authorization. And we have the ability to potentially process their work authorization documentation and paperwork more quickly. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we're actually currently in real time doing that right now. The fact is, though, the surge that we're seeing, and if the numbers and projections correlate throughout 2024 as they did in 2023, as Mayor Johnson indicated, Denver is going to be in a significant financial hole. And so we are really exploring ways that we can decrease our shelter capacity and responsibility through various potential partnerships, initiatives that we're working on internally at this point, but looking forward to sharing more as those projects get off the ground. One of the things we can communicate and are constantly sharing is that at the intake process is a really critical opportunity for our intake partners at DHS to communicate onward travel opportunities and really express to folks that Denver is a welcoming city. We're super excited to have you. It's also 32 degrees outside. We have very limited resources to continue supporting you. Our job market is and gaps are deteriorating. You know, the market share that these folks come in and supply from a work standpoint continues to be filled up by the 40,000 folks that came earlier. And so it's tougher for these folks to immediately find work specifically within the city and county of Denver. So we really encourage onward travel to other cities that may be interested in accepting of newcomers. So we're pushing that at this point, as well as looking at other creative ways to connect folks to potential resources in other cities. Going back quickly before I touch on the work authorization clinics, one of the reasons why Denver has become such a popular destination for Governor Abbott to send folks is economics. It's $80 for a bus ticket from El Paso to Denver. It's I think it's like $200 for an El Paso bus ticket to somewhere like San Diego or Los Angeles or other municipalities. So what we're seeing is Texas is making a financial decision by sending their folks to Denver. It's far cheaper for them to do that. And that's why Denver has found itself with the most newcomers per capita of any city in the United States since this crisis began. But what some of the things we're doing in Denver, yesterday we hosted the first work authorization clinic that the city is actually running. There are a number of other nonprofit providers and partners that have been doing this work for a little while. Denver and our team in the city and county specifically has also organized a clinic. So yesterday we saw 170 individuals who were CBP1 eligible and certified to process through work authorization. And that means filling out some paperwork, getting it authorized by an immigration attorney. But the real opportunity is that we were able to have USCIS, which is kind of the immigration arm of the federal branch, along with FEMA, who can help waive the work authorization fees and then perform biometric accounting of an individual. Both those pieces expedite the work authorization review process. And so in a process that may normally take a parolee or a CBP1 eligible candidate 2 months to get a work authorization from the federal government, by having USCIS on site as well as FEMA, we're able to shorten that process to 2 to 3 weeks. So folks are expecting to get their work authorizations that went through the clinic yesterday, potentially by the end of the month or early March, which is really exciting that we're able to put folks to work very quickly. So we ran one of those clinics yesterday. We saw about 170 folks. We're running another clinic today. We've checked in about 80 so far today. We're expecting that to hopefully get up to 170 as well. And then the city and county will be running a few more of these clinics through the end of February. The state will be running a couple of these as well as some other partners. So hopefully we're able to turn around work authorizations very quickly for folks. So whether or not they're in our shelters or out in the community looking to get formally work authorized, they'll have the legal means to do so. And certainly we'll be able to get folks into some much needed jobs as well. So that is kind of our high level recap of what we're doing in the city and county. Again, there are some other projects and iterations that we're looking at and exploring to, again, decrease these numbers and look at our policies we need to brief council and go through all of those pieces before I think we're in a place to share all of that information here. But really excited to answer questions that folks may have.
Great, thank you, Joshua. We will go to online first. Was there anyone online that had any questions? I'm trying to see everyone. Commissioner Kraft Tharp.
Thank you. So hopefully you can hear me. If not, Andy Kirk can help you. So you said that you get a call 8 hours ahead of time that a bus is coming. Who calls you? Who is that?
Yeah, I believe it's the El Paso local municipality. They have an Office of Emergency Management as well, and they don't call us. They send us an email, and sometimes it's 4 hours after the bus departed. Sometimes it's 2 hours. Sometimes it's an hour before. So it's all really a guessing game. But El Paso will email us with the itinerary for their bus. We don't even get a roster or anything. They just say, this bus left at this time. It's got this many people on it, this number of individuals, this number of families. Have fun.
And they don't always send them to the places you want them to be sent to as
Yeah,
well.
we had some issues, and this is an interesting just reflection on the process as well. We had previously had issues where the bus would drop off in front of the Capitol or in front of the Web building at 11 p.m. at night, and that didn't work with the process. We were able to coordinate more with El Paso to be like, okay, like you're dropping off at these hours, you go to the Web building. If it's after hours, you're going to go to the shelter so these folks can rest and then get processed the next day. One of the ways communities were potentially exploring reducing the number of newcomers that were coming into their own cities was finding buses that would not follow that protocol and finding the bus companies directly, imposing taxes, even just if buses were arriving. Chicago experimented with this, for example. Denver, as a policy, we potentially explored that. Fortunately, Chicago is the guinea pig, and what they ended up finding were two detriments. One, the buses were going to come anyway. They were just going to drop them outside of Chicago. So these folks were dropped off at a suburb in Chicago with no intake process, with municipalities or communities that had no process to support them. And so they were just dropped off somewhere and didn't really have an opportunity to get directly connected to Chicago. And that was pretty messy. The other thing, Governor Abbott ended up just buying plane tickets for these folks, that it was still just as affordable for him to send folks via airline into Chicago as a bus. And so they were getting folks in Midway and O'Hare who had no way or understanding of the United States to get into the intake process. So we decided against that policy. We were just like, okay, let's just set these parameters so you can drop these folks off through our process as needed. So it didn't, it was an interesting experiment to potentially reduce the numbers of newcomers coming from those buses, but it didn't really seem to be successful policy-wise, and we didn't end up implementing something like that.
Thank you. Commissioner Kraft Tharp, are you done?
Yes, I'll listen to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Commissioner Loachman.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm in Boulder County. We have been supporting with staff. Jocelyn Frankheiser, as one example, has been down in Denver for months and months, using her emergency management expertise and disaster response. We, as a board, just for awareness for the rest of MACC members, had a conversation earlier this week about how we might be able to support, and because economic stability is one of our new strategic priorities, the work authorization clinics is right in the line of what we believe is a way to help folks who are coming to this country to be able to work to provide for themselves and their families. So when I'm really pleased to hear this update in a little bit more detail in your presentation. My question I have two questions. One is, I also received an email from Andres Carrera this week, which thousands of people did, I'm sure, in regards to the ask for 500 volunteers to assist with this work. And just curious from the language access piece about how you ensure that you've got, are those certified translators, and how you're just managing that piece, because work authorization is also a really technical activity, and not just what I like to call bar Spanish. Some of you in the room might know what I'm talking about when I say bar Spanish. and so just asking about that piece, and also to know that USCIS and FEMA are both on the ground to move the process in a way that eliminates the cost when you talk about waiving fees. Just curious about how long that, if you can share what that commitment might be. So just I can hear some really creative ways about how to reduce this cost to make it more tangible for Denver, but just curious about how long we might be able, what you're thinking about how long that might be an option.
Yep, great question. So number one, Andres Carrera is an outstanding volunteer recruiter. So if you have ever gotten an email from him, he is dogged and determined to get as many folks into these clinics as possible, and he's doing a great job with it. And yes, we're kind of vetting folks for a number of different operational stations for this work. So we do have interpreters who are right there with our lawyers, basically going through this work authorization paperwork with the migrant or the newcomer. And so they're really on the ground interacting and engaging with these folks pretty directly. There are some that we do need to kind of just translate documents and those pieces as well. So there is a good mix of kind of operational needs and technical needs that are applied in for those folks who are able to interpret or translate. And we also do have folks that are just kind of runners or gophers around the operation to just like help guide and support folks going to restrooms, looking for certain resources throughout the process. So I think we're like utilizing these folks to the highest degree that we can from a technical and operational standpoint. There's also, I mean, this is day number 2, so I think we're learning a lot. Today specifically, we're probably over volunteered for the number of folks that we're going to end up seeing. I'm not going to have any qualms about that, but want to be respectful of folks' time and really exploring the ways that we better operationalize that as we move forward. So really appreciate that question, Councilwoman. And then in terms of the federal support, that's kind of ongoing and open-ended. They've asked us to give them 3 weeks advance notice of when we are scheduling these clinics out. So the last one we're going to have scheduled is March the 5th that the city is running. After that, we're going to continue to evaluate what our options may be. There's a lot of good political will that the mayor has built in Washington with the Biden administration, especially after the border deal kind of collapsed, that we feel like we can expend some of that to get those resources into Denver and really push those folks as long as we kind of give them that advance notice. The limiting factor in terms of how frequently we will need them is really based on the number of newcomers that we're receiving that are eligible for these work authorization clinics. So we know that there are kind of 2 pathways, or 3 pathways technically, a newcomer can come through. It's the CBP1 process. Those are folks that are really immediately eligible for these work authorization clinics. There's the TPS folks, the temporary protective status individuals that Secretary Mayorkas is kind of getting tried about right now. So that decision and whether or not that might get extended for Venezuelans and over a longer period of time is yet to be determined. If they do kind of extend that temporary protective status for the Venezuelan folks, they will also fit into that quicker work authorization category. But what we're seeing is those numbers are far outweighed by the number of newcomers that we see that are not work authorized or that are not CBP1 eligible, that are not paroled, and therefore have to go through basically the asylum seeker process. That creates a far longer runway for work authorization. And so we have to better assess who is coming into Denver, who is staying in our shelters based on those different distinctions to understand how much more frequently and how long we really need these work authorization clinics. So I don't have a great clear answer for you, but those are the things that we're balancing and exploring.
Yeah, that's great. If I can just add a comment, because I think what I'm hearing, and I think it's a fabulous example, and I know there were folks at NACO that were having some of these conversations and advocating at a federal level what I believe is a bipartisan opportunity in regards to work authorization. What we continue to hear, and I say that as a Latina, as an immigrant in this country, what we continue to hear in our communities is these processes that are set up that take 20 to 30 years to move through the process in the United States to be able to work and provide for your family and come out of the shadows. And you're showing us in Denver a way to set up and get services and eliminate fees and bring people in who want to help to change a process that's a 2 to 3 month into it a 2 to 3 weeks. So I would just commend that. And I would also encourage us to really like, how do we advocate with that? Like, how do we move something like that forward for all of the people that are really looking for options? So great that you've got all the different levels of support, and just want to appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Loachman. Is there anyone else online? I'm not seeing anyone. We have about 5 more minutes left. We are a little bit over time, but I think this is a very, very important topic affecting all of our metro cities and counties. Is there anyone in the room? Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity. Hello, everybody. In terms of the statistical analysis of the type of immigrant, what's the demographic breakdown? And of that group, who are the most able to get immediate employment?
Yeah, all the folks that we're seeing, I think someone shared the statistic with me, 96% of the folks that we end up engaging with, who we call as newcomer or migrants, are folks originally from Venezuela. The other 4% seems to honestly be children who were born on these folks' journey from Venezuela to the southern border. Plenty of folks have had given birth in Colombia or Mexico, and so those children.
The gender breakdown?
I'm not sure the gender breakdown. We are seeing a good mix of single men, single mothers with children, and complete family units, and non-traditional family units. So you kind of see all shapes and sizes.
What about a breakdown of skills?
Skills, so that's kind of transparently been a gap in our intake process. That our process was stood up as an emergency operation just to identify name, date of birth, identifying information. We're really working hard at collecting a lot of these skills. We know there's a wide variety. I mean, I've engaged with folks who are teachers in Venezuela, who are lawyers, who engaged in high education jobs and fled based on the circumstances there, and are just really excited to get themselves into any opportunity in the United States. So we're seeing all ranges of skills, and folks who are currently working without work authorization, who are just going out and doing some jobs, who are far more skilled than the work that they're doing, but looking to provide for their families. So we don't have that breakdown. I think in a few of the projects and new protocols that the city may be building, we're going to better be able to collect that information.
And I'll say very quickly, one statistics that we don't really talk about are newcomers that got here that are pregnant. And we've had over 100, less than 300 to this point, the last update from Denver Health, of babies born from newcomers. So we have a whole group of folks that may not be counted in some of our statistics.
Yeah, and actually, Councilman, I'm glad you brought up children and newcomers through this process. One thing that's really interesting, or I'm finding very interesting about this process, is we are having children apply for work authorization at these clinics. And that's because a lot of the benefits that a child could receive through kind of that documentation process, we don't want them to be child laborers or go to work or anything like that, but they do receive certain benefits by applying for work authorization. So as you think about those things and find those processes, like any way we can ensure young people and children are getting authorized, getting documented is going to be a good thing, even though it seems kind of oxymoronic to have a child go through a work authorization clinic.
Yeah, in my nonprofit work, working with Afghans, Ukrainians, we now have a lot of Haitians in Broomfield as well. We've noticed that actually the kids get their work authorization first, and the parents are very angry.
Yeah.
But it is the part of the process of applying for work authorization for the entire family, because they do receive some benefits. Now, I will say to speak to 2 things, and I know a lot of our families have to go through biometrics, which is actually a pretty invasive process. So I would like for you to speak to that, because some people don't understand what biometrics does and what they have to do when they apply for that CPT-1 application. And then just sort of the funding aspect of it. So we just came back from DC. I just took an hour-and-a-half immigration course, and I have a lot more questions now than I have answers. But $8 million from FEMA is just not enough. So where are you guys at with that funding? And then if you could speak to the biometrics.
Yeah, I can't speak to a lot of the details of the invasive nature of the biometrics. I can tell you that in our operation, there's like a drape and pole situation. Like they do keep the area very private, and then FEMA's doing pictures and scans and all sorts of those things. So they do want to keep it private. If you are more familiar with
They do like eye scans. There's just a lot of scanning going on. And in our children, just so you know, I've been through like even blood draws. So they're doing a lot of sort of invasive.
I know we're not doing blood draws in the
I
web
know you're
building
not
today,
probably doing
but
it for that.
yeah.
But those who are seeking, even if they're green cards or, you know.
So it is, I mean, it is a very private process because it is kind of all of your personal information that they use to account and track you down. So yeah, definitely an invasive process there. In terms of funding, this is one of the reasons why the city is exploring operationalizing this ourselves, because the costs are very low. The biggest costs that we're incurring at these clinics are paper and charter buses to transport folks. Everything else is being done through city staff or through volunteers, through volunteer attorneys, volunteers to help with interpretation, and then the federal support is coming without a charge as well.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of the FEMA reimbursement and those pieces, definitely not enough to fill some of the gaps that we're seeing from the
Yeah, it
supports.
was a little discouraging. Commissioner Lee?
I know we're short on time, and I want to acknowledge and respect the incredible compassion of my commissioner and council colleagues. I think that is really what is most beautiful to me, is that the heart to serve those in need is really bipartisan, and it's truly, I think, a Denver Metro characteristic. I think where I pause is just the numbers. I mean, the magnitude is just, you know, I want to make sure that I'm balancing compassion with this $180 million number. With, you know, it sounds like, is it close to 35,000 that have come total?
40,000. We're
It's now 40,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think my tracker's at 39,000, and we'll surpass 40,000 by the end of this month.
So that's twice the size of Louisville. And just, I think, finding the appropriate way to balance. I love the work authorization option as a bipartisan solution. And I wonder, too, if there's any element of communications work, communications professionals in Texas to help educate people before they make decisions to get on to a bus. Nobody can be forced onto a bus to go anywhere.
I think the way Denver expresses and the Denver metro area is expressing that compassion in terms of having those conversations and seeing what folks are interested in is different than potentially that individual's experience in Texas when they board a bus. Our understanding is there's not a lot of direction given on those circumstances. Folks are told they're getting on a bus to go somewhere new, and that is really it. So there is some, you know, we have explored partnership opportunities to communicate to folks about the potential difficulties of making a life in Colorado. In Texas, that doesn't seem to be our sustainable pathway out of this. We are exploring other partnership and conversations with other communities across the country that could be viable towards that. It does seem like at the end of the day, Denver is going to take in what we have to take in. Our opportunity is to understand how we reduce those numbers through creative means, whether that's work authorization or other partnerships. So that's kind of what the mayor's office is currently exploring from a policy standpoint. But I appreciate the question about Texas. I wish it was different. I think what we found over the last 18 months is it doesn't really look like that on the ground with them. And so we're finding our own ways.
Commissioner Lee, I'll be really quick because I know we're out of time. I would say that one of the things I appreciate about what Mayor Johnson is also doing, he's been on Univision. He speaks fluent Spanish. He has communicated very clearly to whether it's through Univision that Denver is a welcoming city, but we have no, we do not have the resources to maintain, and we're 30 degrees and cold, and there are places. So he's done that. We've had communications in Texas, organic communication directly to folks that are coming over the border that Denver is not the place for you to be coming to as well. And then the channels that Josh was talking about, trying to have discussions with folks in El Paso, which have been a little bit more welcoming than the actual state discussions. And so there's been a lot of real direct discussion, and in Spanish and across Univision that's spoken, that's televised throughout Central and South America. he's leveraged those opportunities. And I think folks know the message, but the cost of moving folks to Denver compared to Chicago, and also there's a political piece too. So,
And I think one, if I may say,
kudos to the mayor. And, you know, I appreciate the accurate Spanish, Marta, being used in speaking of.
I don't think he does bar Spanish, but he does other Spanish.
School Spanish. I think one last thing to just wrap up in terms of that communication piece, and in terms of the different initiatives and programs Denver may explore, the way we communicate with these folks. Everyone is on WhatsApp, and communication spreads like wildfire across these groups. So as soon as you kind of communicate a new policy protocol situation to folks, yeah, people in Denver are already getting that to folks at the border and across our network.
And I'm getting WhatsApp updates as well.
Yeah, so it is the 21st century of immigration. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Posner, we have seen too, I've been some random text threads with people out of Denver, of people actually going back to Mexico. And so we've actually seen people going back there because they have other better connections there. So there isn't a lot of talk about that. There also isn't a lot of talk of, hey, we're seeing about 10% of the Venezuelan population. We're not seeing like 100% of their population coming here. So we want to know and honor that with Colombia as well. One added aspect is that after going out to DC, and we really need to speak to our reps and our senators about working on that work authorization, because actually President Biden can do that. He can move work authorization forward, and we need to be speaking to our reps and our senators about that to say, hey, this is a problem, and make sure you can get other people to write them as well. Rep Escobar, Commissioner Stolzman met with her, and they are moving forward with what's called the Dignity Act. If you guys want to look that up on the internet, it just talks about a citizenship pathway, DACA. It also talks about tightening the border as well. And then removing the wait period for work authorization for asylum seekers. I believe that's in that bill as well. I need to look it up myself, but we just need to be advocates and letting our reps know that this is a major problem. So thank you for speaking.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes left. Can you want to go for it?
Well,
thank you so much, Josh.
Yeah, thank you for having
Madam Chair, very much. Thank you. What I might do, and I know most people in the room are very intimate with the housing bills that have been introduced or plan to be introduced here real shortly. As we all know, there are 3 kind of key areas of legislation this year. The first is related to what they're calling strategic growth. There's an area associated with ADUs, and then an area associated with transit-oriented communities. The ADU bill is the one of the 3 areas that has been introduced, and that's House Bill 1152. It is it's pretty restrictive in regards to, we've had a lot of conversations with our local governments and our members with regards to, and one of the concerns that we all have, I think, is the usurping of local authority as it relates to any of these bills, right?
All have problems.
And yes, indeed. And and the thing about the ADU bill, which I find puzzling, is that the majority of communities within this region have already instituted an ADU ordinance for the most part, including counties, right? So, but that bill, for those that don't know, is basically by right, communities they shall allow ADUs anywhere where single family housing is currently zoned. Also, there's a restriction, you cannot allow, I'm trying to say, there's a restriction on parking. So you can't make it a determinant that parking has to be associated with the dwelling unit. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So that's that one. That's
I
the one
can
that,
understand it, everybody can understand.
there are some incentives with the bill, but I think, are pretty darn good for the most part. But again, Dr. Carr board has taken a position on that bill. Will next Wednesday. CML has taken a position of oppose unless amended to remove the preemptions that are in there. The other 2 have not been introduced to the strategic growth bill, and that is there are drafts of that. It's very close. It could even drop today. Senator Zenzinger and Senator Kirkmeyer on that bill. And this is the one I think that is most comforting probably of the 3 areas, for at least I'll speak personally from Dr. Cox's staff perspective. It respects the planning process, and it respects doing plans, whether those be regional or local housing assessments to truly understand what the housing problem is. We all know we need more units, right? But the question is the type of housing, where it should be located, and all those types of questions. So, so we're thankful for this bill. I think there will be broad support for this one. It does, so there's two components of that. There's a housing needs assessment that must be done, and then housing action plans. Each community or region is responsible for having to have an action plan and reporting on that every 5 years as to just kind of a tracking mechanism. The last I might mention is where there's probably the most heat, and that's the transit-oriented communities bill. A lot of work's been done on this, and I know Commissioner Odoricio, he's still on the line. He's been very intimate in this as well. So basically, what this bill does is that if your community has a rail station, a future bus rapid transit route, or frequent bus service within your community of 15-minute headways or less, then you are designated a transit-oriented community. And if you're a transit-oriented community, then you have to come up with a housing opportunity goal. So basically it's a land use exercise that around, I'll give you an example. So around a rail station, if so within a half-mile radius of that rail station, you had to have an average of 40 units per acre designated basically through your zoning ordinance to allow for that type, a minimum of that to allow. If you cannot or do not wish to comply with that, there will be, based on the draft bill, there will be restrictions to your highway users tax fund, the HUTF. As you can imagine, that is not going over very well with local governments, and because quite frankly, there's a number of reasons for that. There's doesn't appear to be any nexus between HUTF and some arbitrary housing goal that we're having trouble understanding. Highway users, HUTF is basically used for maintenance and safety, right, of our existing roadway network, and so that's problematic. So there's that stick. There's also that bill hasn't dropped yet. So there's a draft that came out yesterday, a more recent draft that came out yesterday, which I'm happy to share with the group, Madam Chair, if they so desire to have that. We're expecting probably one more round of drafts on that bill, Councilman, but that's probably a couple weeks away before that gets introduced. But it's baked. That bill is baked. There is another provision in there that I want to make sure everybody understands, that if you don't comply with that housing opportunity goal, the state, and it's in there as may, request an injunction, basically forcing local government to comply with that goal. So it's toxic. I'm not going to lie to you. I'll be honest. I don't think there's a whole lot we could probably do in the House right now associated with this bill. I think for a hopeful that we can have, based on conversations that we've had, that there could be some room on the Senate side to try to get something, because I truly do believe, and I know Commissioner Odoricio feels similar to this, that there's a win-win opportunity for this TOC bill based on incentives, because the majority of communities that have rail stations or whatever have already done a significant amount of rezoning associated with those for high density mixed use. And for whatever reason, those zones or areas are not developing the way they had hoped and anticipated. We believe that the appropriate conversation for us in the state to be having is helping figure out what the barriers are in those areas and getting those things moving. Let's start with that before you start some tabletop exercise of, arbitrarily designing land use. So
in Arapahoe County, we try to build them and then they get burnt out.
Yeah, well, I actually had a conversation with the Arapahoe County staff, and they're looking at, based on their tabletop exercise, they're looking at, 60-story towers in order to comply with this, right? I mean, you can zone for it, but who's asking the question whether you should have
or you can afford it?
Well, and the infrastructure investment that's required for that is just, I think, it's being lost. It's the implementation part of this that's really causing us some concern too. But Madam Chair, I'll just leave it there. I could talk forever on this.
I know.
So
We
just so
could
you know.
actually add a whole other hour to this meeting, but I am not a meeting person that would last for, longer than an hour and a half. So.
Be careful what you ask for because you may get it.
I know. And I know other commissioners need to hop off here. And I'm reading here in the chat here, but we do it really quick here. Chantel Lewis, Commissioner Lewis, you said there's been an RTD reform bill. I believe Rep. Linsett might be running that one. I'm not sure.
Yes, and Senator Winter.
Yeah, and Senator Winter, they're hoping that we can discuss that here. We do have to keep the focus of, serving our unhoused, and I think that we can do that with, I think, that RTD bill as well, because they do rely a lot on our public transportation. And then Steve, your question is does MACC have consensus that we should ask the Gov? Is that your word for governor? And TOC sponsors remove the, I like to call it the HTFU stick, but you like to call it the HUTF stick. We have not had any sort of consensus, but we could, it's hard because our next meeting is canceled next month. Do you want to speak to that, Steve?
What?
Yeah, I was just curious if we want to kind of do, can you guys hear me?
We can.
We can read you.
Can you all hear me? Okay, good. I'm on my way to the airport, and my apologies, I couldn't be there in person, but I mean, we could even just do a straw poll to find out if we have consensus enough on that one finite specific issue. We might be able to do just like a letter saying, hey, we look forward to working with you on all these things and finding a win-win, and but our focus would be to ask you not to use HUTF as a threat, given the fact that it's used for safety and maintenance. We believe there are other ways to accomplish this goal. If we don't have a full consensus, then I would withdraw the recommendation or offer. But if we have it, and it's, I bet Doug Rex could be able to take that letter, and we can all take that letter and throw folks and just kind of give them some positive redirection off of that one piece. But again, I'm not advocating hard if we don't have consensus.
Okay. Denver County, we can't do a straw vote on anything that's going through legislatively. We have a legislative team. So no matter how I personally feel on that, we wouldn't be able to participate in a straw vote.
You know what we could do, Commissioner Odorizio, I'm wondering if we could reach out just to the different jurisdictions and what their view is on that anyway, because we do have that view with CCI, we belong to CCAT as well. If that is a consistent view that we're seeing, I don't see why it's already gone through those legislative processes. If Denver's already discussed that issue, if we could just see the pattern and we can just list the jurisdictions in the metro area, would you be amenable to that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk offline about that.
Denver wouldn't be able to participate.
Yeah, we'll be able to check with Denver. We know, I think there's been many talks about this, and I believe that that's high on the priority of removing that HUTF stick and working on incentives. So, but if our voice can add to it, then I don't see why we can't do that if we see consensus. So, okay, thank you so much for today. Thank you for being here. And Chantel, Councilmember Lewis, I definitely see you there, and we'll bring it back to put on our agenda to look at that. So thank you. All right, see you all.
Thanks. See ya.